Good morning, everybody. My name is Aidan Feighery, and I'm very proud to be presenting on behalf of my group today. This semester, our group worked with the World Bank's NBS Invest team, and so I'll be presenting today on unlocking finance for nature-based solutions in least developed countries. If you look behind me to my left, you'll see a picture of a beautiful mangrove forest in Senegal's Saloum Delta. This mangrove forest isn't just pretty, though. It provides significant ecosystem benefits for the local community by dampening wave action, by preventing soil erosion, acting as a nursery for local fisheries, and as a carbon sink for the global fight against climate change, benefiting us all the way over here. A sustainable asset valuation performed by the organization Nature-Based Infrastructure found that over the next 40 years, the Saloum Delta mangrove forest alone will provide $6.2 billion worth of value for the local community. The kicker is that without human intervention, they're going to do all of that for free. Unfortunately, ecosystems like this one are under threat in Senegal and across the globe, and it's for that reason that our clients' work is so important. Let me introduce you to World Bank's NBS Invest team, who are focused on mobilizing a $10 million fund in order to scale nature-based solutions in least developed countries. Nature-based solutions are those that use natural systems in order to benefit local communities as well as local ecosystems. And least developed countries are those United Nations designated countries that are facing the largest structural and socioeconomic challenges. So all in all, the NBS Invest team seeks to use systems that already exist in nature in order to fight environmental degradation in some of the countries that need the help the most. But there's a huge problem facing them in their work. In 1992, the United Nations held the Rio Convention and set a series of sustainable development goals. Among those goals is reaching an annual investment in nature-based solutions of $738 billion by the year 2050. As of the most recent data from the United Nations Environment Program in 2023, that annual investment totals only $200 billion, which means that we have a lot of ground to cover. But if you look at the chart behind me, you'll also see that there's a green and blue area on those bars. The green area being public funding and the blue being private. Right now, only 17% of that annual investment is made up of private funding. Public funding can only do so much, can only grow to such a degree. In order to make up that gap in 2050, we need to grow the private sector's involvement and investment in this area. And it's for that reason that we have been tasked with doing exactly that. Over the course of this past semester, we've conducted 15 interviews with subject matter experts. We've analyzed 18 case studies to know what works and what doesn't. And we've looked at, ultimately, coming up with 15 barriers that impede investment in this field and 13 solutions that we've seen real evidence of addressing one or more of those barriers. Today, we're going to be focusing on just one of those case studies. We're going to zoom back in on that Saloum Delta region, and we're going to look at the multi-billion-dollar food corporation Danone and their work in mangrove restoration. A couple key points on this project. The first is that this is a broad partnership. In order to do this project, they acted through their organization, the Livelihoods Carbon Fund, which involves 20 other corporations that they work with. And in addition, they worked with a local NGO called Oceania, which means that they had that local knowledge and component. Their investment totaled $3.3 million between 2009 and 2012. And during that same time period, they were able to restore 10,000 acres worth of mangrove forests, which, for context, is a landmass roughly equivalent to the southern tip of Manhattan all the way up to Harlem. Since then, that landmass has grown to 20,000 acres, which takes us into the Hudson, and they have sequestered 500,000 tons of CO2. But when I tell you those things about the case study, it doesn't tell us anything about the barriers that they faced in accomplishing their work. It doesn't tell us anything about the solutions they employed in order to do so, and it doesn't give us any lessons that we can use to replicate their success elsewhere. Let's look first at those barriers that we see in there. And we've identified 6 different categories of barriers that impede private investment. We're going to be looking at just 3 of those today that are relevant to our case study, the first of which is market failure. Here we have a classic tragedy of the commons case, where there just isn't an economic incentive for private individuals to sustain the public good that is these mangrove forests. We also see high project risk and challenging economics. It takes a lot of money to plant those mangroves, and it's going to be a long time before they grow up and actually show the benefits that they're intended to do. We also have high risk. There's no telling of what kind of a natural disaster could knock out your plantings. We finally have a lack of regulation simply on the basis that nobody was using a globally standardized reporting mechanism prior to this project's introduction. So each one of these sub-bullet points is a generalized barrier that we've come up with through our research. And you can see now how when we fit them into the case studies that we've analyzed, it provides unique context and a unique illustration for how these barriers play out in the real world. But now let's get into some of the solutions that have been involved in this case study. The first of which is carbon markets. In order to recoup some of their investment, Danone created carbon markets and sold carbon credits from the offset carbon in their project from planting these mangroves to companies aiming to reach their ESG goals. Something that's really important in this case is that they also did so within the UN Clean Development Mechanism framework, meaning that there was the UN Clean Development Mechanism's standardized reporting and measurement techniques, which has two key effects. The first of which is that this project then exists in collaboration and community with other projects that use the same measurement techniques. But it also means that you can trust more readily the carbon credits that are produced by this project and trust that the impact that they're having is actually going to happen. We also have some business-driven approaches. The first of which is local stakeholder engagement. Local stakeholder engagement through their collaboration with that local NGO Oceanium provides them access to local knowledge, and it also generates local trust, which is really important for that high project risk barrier, because whenever you have that local trust component, you're going to have fewer conflicts with the community over time and have a more sustainable project. We also see anchoring of nature-based solution in the corporate strategy. The fact that they had that pre-existing organization before the project even started meant that they were considering nature-based solutions, and it meant that this project was likely to happen in the first place. All of that said, our paper produced 16 generalized recommendations that are targeted to both public and private sector actors. We're going to be looking at 4 of those that are well represented in this case today. The first of which has to do with the strategy and that anchoring of nature-based solution in the corporate strategy. We found through our interviews and through our research that it's incredibly important to integrate nature-based solutions into your core business model, because that means that you're going to be able to understand the degree to which nature-based solutions can be a cost-effective and perhaps more effective option for you than perhaps the gray infrastructure projects that you're already planning. Another key recommendation that we found has to do with partnerships. We found that it's incredibly important to make those large partnerships so that you have access to a broader amount of knowledge, more capital, and you can de-risk the investment by doing so. We found specifically, for instance, that for smaller groups, it's really important to work with larger investors so that you can reduce that risk and have access to more capital. And for larger groups, it's often really important for them to collaborate with the smaller investors or the smaller groups that are already working on the ground and have access to that local knowledge that can reduce the amount of time that you need in order to get your project up and running. Another component, though, is that collaboration with Oceanium, which leads us into our community's recommendation, which has to do with planning for and with local stakeholders. We found in our interviews time and time again that it was critical to involve the local community both in the planning process through including them as decision makers, and also keeping them in mind when planning your project in terms of making sure that there are community benefits involved. When you do so, you do build that local trust and bond, and that means that you're going to have a more sustainable project because of the fact that you'll face fewer impediments and have access to more knowledge that's specific to your project. Finally, we have standardization. In this case, we saw heavily used the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, but in our interviews, we also heard often mentioned the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Regardless of which mechanism you use, the most important thing is that you use one of them across the industry, because that means that we can have a conversation about our projects no matter who the developer is or where the project is going on. And it also means that we can better measure our impact and communicate it. And as Dr. Cohen said almost a year ago on Orientation Day, what gets measured gets done, and we want this to get done. And so standardization is incredibly important to us. And with that, I'd like to thank my team for their incredible work this semester. I'd like to thank our wonderful faculty advisor, Dr. Sarah Jossam, and I'd also like to thank our client contacts who have been so helpful this entire time. Thank you all for listening, and I'd love to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Aidan. That was so interesting. So, as you know, I'm from Mumbai, and in the last few decades, we saw like 40% of our mangroves degrading. And that was mainly because of urbanization and infrastructure development. So, I saw that you had economic challenges as part of your challenges. So, I'm wondering what you think about urbanization as one of those issues and what solutions you could suggest for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say one of the things that came up in our research was actually integrating nature-based solutions into gray infrastructure projects. So while that urbanization is going on, making sure that in the planning stage you include, for instance, planning nature-based solutions that allow for those mangrove forests to thrive, or else implementing some way to support the local ecosystem while also completing that gray infrastructure project. We found that to be really important. Or including a component while that urbanization is going on, invest in ecosystems elsewhere or nearby in order to support those at the same time.
Thank you.
Over here.
Thanks for a great presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned a lot about standardization and the UN carbon market. I was wondering if in your research you saw any validity to a broader voluntary carbon market, or something that private investors might be more interested in.
Yeah, in our research, we saw a lot of barriers to carbon market success, actually. A lot of them have to do with that standardization. For instance, if you as a company are aiming to meet your ESG goals and you buy carbon credits that don't have a standardized method of measurement and reporting, then you don't necessarily have a guarantee that the impact you want to create is actually happening, because you're not sure about the impact in the first place. So we found that standardization is a really important part of making those voluntary markets, but it's also about creating demand for this in the first place, by which I mean we as a general public, by pressuring these companies, are making a market for these carbon credits to happen. And by pushing policymakers to institute policies that require companies to offset their carbon, we make these carbon markets in the first place. And so these markets need to happen on both the supply and the demand side simultaneously.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan, for this really comprehensive presentation. So one question that always kept coming up to me when involving these large corporates, especially in these least developed countries, is especially if you're looking at carbon credits as a source of financing, right? So who owns this land becomes a big question, and especially if countries like, if the investment is coming from countries like Germany or France, for example, there's this huge question of what happens to the rights of these communities in these least developed countries. So how do you go about looking at these financing mechanisms and also balancing the rights of these communities?
That's a really great question. There are two components to my answer. The first of which has to do with that including local community benefits aspect, making sure that in your planning process you're being mindful. Whenever you include local stakeholders in that decision-making process, it means that your project is less likely to impede on the rights of those local stakeholders. But also, we found it incredibly important, actually. We found it incredibly important to make sure that in the course of your investment, especially if you're, for instance, a multilateral development bank, it's really important to invest in the government itself and its local bureaucracy so that it has the capacity for governance and self-governance. And so we found that, for instance, across projects, between projects, it's really important for those multilateral development banks to invest in bureaucratic ability to, for instance, collect local taxes on this project in order to benefit that local government. And so we're hoping that these projects not only benefit the local community through the nature-based solutions they introduce, but also, in general, they can benefit the local community by building up government capacity as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So 5 excellent final briefings. I want to congratulate all of you and all the groups for doing a great job. So what does this mean? What did we learn? Well, first, we learned that we can do professional quality work for clients that are important, doing important work in the world, which was our objective here. Uh, in the course of your professional development, you will eventually be clients. Some of you may even be faculty advisors. We have a couple of alums here who are actually your advisors. And so what we're in the process of doing and what you're in the process of being part of is an emerging profession of sustainability professionals. And this has been going on for a couple of decades in this program, and it's going on throughout the country, throughout the world. In the last several years, this program has become more international in its student body than it was in its first decade, which was primarily US, which shows you something about the growing interest in preserving the planet that we're seeing all over the planet. This is not an accident. This is what's happening. So I know that if you're following the events in Washington, they're a little disconcerting. I actually got here originally when Ronald Reagan became president, and I left the Environmental Protection Agency because everything I was working on got stopped. A couple of years later, it got started up again, and I learned from that experience two things. First, people like to breathe. They kind of get used to it after a while. And that environmental protection is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And every project that we just saw spoke to that fundamental fact. And so there are people, and some of them are kind of stuck in the 1970s and 80s in their mindset about how they think the world works, that don't think that the environment and protecting it is a necessity. But they are a smaller and smaller group of people. They're getting old. Pretty soon they'll be dead. You're going to replace them. You're going to replace them, and your generation will replace them with a different mindset. And I've been working on environmental protection since 1975, which may even be before some of your parents were born, I don't know. But I'll say this, that I see the momentum here. I see the momentum behind what's going on, and it can't be stopped by reactionary federal government in the United States. It can't be stopped by authoritarians in other parts of the world. It can't be stopped because it's fundamental. And so I believe that you have learned a lot about how to be an environmental professional this year. In the workshop, you learned how to integrate the different areas of knowledge, whether it's science itself or science communication or management or analyzing the politics of bills and things like that. And then in this semester, you produced high-quality professional work for clients who, as I said, are trying to make the world a better place. And so I hope you feel accomplished and that the investment of your time and effort and money that went into getting here and being here, you see the benefits of that. You'll see more of it once you're employed. And I would say this, that there are people that worry about, well, what's going to happen to our field? And what I can tell you is that it's expanding all over the place. So what I call the green economy has been growing steadily throughout the 21st century. During the Great Recession, 2008 and 09, it was the only part of the economy that was growing in the United States. And that it's growing because it's not because companies are suddenly discovering social responsibility, because I don't expect that. It's that they're realizing that the way they need to make money requires them to pay attention to this part of the economy. And things like climate change and toxics and pollution are real. And they need to be addressed if people are going to continue to prosper and if we're going to be able to eventually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and eliminate extreme poverty. So I hope you're proud of what you've accomplished. You're almost done. The next time I see you I'll be wearing this funny robe and this hat. You'll be wearing the same funny robes and hats, although you have the Columbia ones. I have Sunni buffaloes, which is a different color. Actually, my cap and gown are the same colors as the New York Mets. So, so those of you who are Mets fans, I'll be wearing orange and blue. Uh, and those are the Sunni colors also. So again, I want to congratulate you. There are still, I believe, plenty of refreshments in the back. So I will look forward to seeing everybody here at graduation when hopefully I'll be able to shake your hand.